let me just briefly make an observation under an overview of the Reformation. Let me just do the big thing first of all. The first thing is, when we talk about the Reformation, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a historical period of time, but back in the time where we're talking about, we're in the medieval period, the Middle Ages. The Renaissance is just beginning to dawn. And there's all kinds of humanistic material. We'll talk about that probably next week. But there was all kinds of calls because it was easy to see the church was enormously corrupt. And there were all kinds of calls for church renewal and all kinds of recognitions that there are obvious abuses. There is the opulence of the church. There is the immorality of the church leaders. There is the superstition that abounds in all of these kind of things. And there were all kinds of attempts to renew the church in terms of, because most of the complaints or attempts were to deal with obvious abuses and to clean up the institution. But the Reformation started with an attempt to clean up an abuse. When Martin Luther nailed that set of 95 Theses, he had no idea of reforming the church. He was a devout, pious Catholic monk who was convinced the Pope couldn't know what was going on and only needed to be informed. But as events unfolded, Luther and his companions were committed not simply to restructure or to purify the church, but to cut it down right at its roots in terms of they began to realize it was built on a rotten foundation and it needed to be reformed and not simply renewed. So in one sense, the Reformation is a reformation, and yet it's really the beginning of something new in terms of what had happened historically. There were obviously roots with the past. So what are we talking about? Well, in terms of the main figures in the Reformation, as we'll be talking about, there are a number, but the three main ones are Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli. I don't have but Zwingli is spelt Z is what my heart wants to say, but Z, W-I-N-G-L-I, which is what we named our Schnauzer when we had a Schnauzer, because he's a kind of attack dog of this group. And then the third is John Calvin. Now, there are a number of other individuals, there are a number of other people whose names will be coming up, but those are the three major individuals. There are also, so you have, and those three individuals are called the magisterial reformers. They're called that because their reformation was carried out in connection with the magistrates. Now, this is going to be a central issue, and underneath it all is the church and state were viewed as a seamless garment. And when Luther and Zwingli especially began to change the church, it had huge ramifications on the society. And that's why all of this gets enmeshed in politics. But there's another group who comes on the scene, and they are despised by others, and yet they are important in a different way, and that is the Anabaptists. Now, central to the way the church worked was that you were baptized as a child, you were baptized as an infant, and that was a sign really that you were in the state as well as in the church, because the two overlapped entirely. As we'll see, in the early 1520s, a group of people came to be convinced of believers' baptism, and they began to practice adult baptism. Now, because they'd been baptized as infants, they were accused of baptizing again, and the Anna means Anabaptists or rebaptizers. They rejected the title because they said the first baptism wasn't baptism, but we'll get into them. But the key for them And where they become significant, and this has huge implications as we think about history and we think about the United States, and that is they believed that religion should be free from the power of the state. And that's one of the foundational principles upon which the United States is built. But they were rejected both by the Reformers and by the Catholics. So they are sort of on the outside here on both sides. And then, so you have the magisterial Reformers, especially Luther, Zwingli, Calvin. You have the Anabaptists, who are a group who want to go further than any of them want to go. And then you have a little bit later, and we'll talk about this toward the end of our studies, the Counter-Reformation. Because the Catholics became very aware of some abuses, and they knew they needed to be dealt with. But at the same time, they wanted to affirm what they were against. And so in the Council of Trent and a number of other things that took on, you had the Catholic Church defining itself in a very particular way against what was going on. So the third thing I just want to observe under this kind of preliminary way is you have three kind of major areas geographically. You have the German Reformation, which is Martin Luther, and Philip Melanchthon becomes important in there. And ultimately that leads to Lutheranism, and Lutheranism then moves north and into Scandinavia. So you have that kind of central part of Europe up through. Then you have the Swiss Reformation, and the Swiss Reformation begins in Zurich, and then it will take in a number of different places in the Swiss Confederation, and Geneva's kind of on the boundaries of the Swiss Confederation at that time. And the Swiss Confederation will lead to the Reformed churches. And then there's a very different, and it's later, and it's really bound up with politics. You have the English or the British side of it with King Henry and all that happens, and that will be the root of the Anglican churches, and then some of the issues that come out of that particular thing. So that's sort of the main people, the main areas, and what will ultimately come out of it, the Lutherans, the Reformed churches, and the Anglican churches in contrast to the Catholic Church in that part of the world. Now let me just stop here and see if there's any things that you want to clarify on that particular part. Okay? So,
Gary, you may have already gotten, or you may get to this later. Is there anything special about him nailing this?
Yeah, let me get there. So,
I'll wait.
the question for those who are watching is, was there anything special about Luther nailing things to the door? And on one level, no, there was nothing special about it. It was ordinary way of dealing with a debate, but it became extraordinary because there's an interesting image, and Karl Barth used it later to describe himself reading the book of Romans and coming out of liberalism, and he said, I was like a man in a church tower in the utter darkness, and I reached out and found myself hanging on to a rope to steady myself. But it turned out the rope was the bell rope, and I was clanging a bell that I didn't know. And that's a great picture of Luther. Luther was trying to steady himself to figure things out, and it turned out he was pulling on a bell, and all of Germany began to hear the bell. And all kinds of things happened out of that. But he had no intention of, did a very ordinary, innocuous act, except it turned it out to be lighting a match that was close to dynamite. So, but we'll come back to that. So why does it still matter? Why are we concerned about it? And in what way is it still important? There's a whole bunch of things we could say, but I want to say three here, just to get these things in front of us. First of all, the Reformation involves the rediscovery of essential Christian truth. which are no less needed today, even though our context is very different than it was then. And let me think of 4 truths. There are more than these that can be involved, but let me just think of 4 here. First was the recovery of the Bible as the ultimate source of authority. The Reformation is more than anything else a battle for the Bible, because the issue is who speaks with authority, and has God spoken? And Luther and the Reformers' point was that the church must be validated by the Bible, not the Bible validated by the church. And the issue of the authority of the Bible is very relevant and very significant to the time in which we're living. I was talking to some folks earlier, and you've heard me say this, but there recently was a document that a group of Christian leaders, evangelical leaders, got together and published a document, and they called it the Nashville Manifesto because they met in Nashville and they did it. And it's a document that has is a statement about the current state of marriage and the current state of sexuality, and the understanding of it. It is a thoroughly biblical statement in terms of defending the biblical view of marriages between one man and one woman, talking about gender not as a social construct, but as a divine construct, and things of that particular nature. And it's interesting because of the feedback. They expected this to have some significance in the Christian community, but the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of these places have taken up this particular statement. And you've got a bunch who are, I don't know quite what to put other than to say they are people who have an evangelical heritage, and they like to call them evangelicals, who were saying, no, this is too emphatic. This is too, we've got to adjust to the realities of what our culture is saying and what our culture is doing now. The whole issue of gender and marriage is certainly not the most important issue of our time, but it's a kind of flag issue that says, who has the final word? Because the Bible's very clear on the matter. That marriage is intended by God between a man and a woman, and it is God who made us male and female, and not social construct. So that issue of the authority of the Bible is very much a present issue, and virtually all of the major denominations in Protestantism, supposedly the heirs of the Reformation, have abandoned the Bible as having any meaningful authoritative effect. So that's not an old issue. It's one that is very present and debated. Another one is the sufficiency of Christ and the work of Christ as Savior and mediator. Salvation was viewed in the Catholic Church as a synthesis between God and man. And men needed to earn a righteousness before God. God would give them grace, and I will talk about this more later, but somebody applied it, and I think it's a very good analogy, in certain kind of, this is a parody kind of statement, but it's nevertheless true. Grace was viewed as a product that you receive from God. Someone likens it to Red Bull energy drink. And God would, by his grace, infuse energy into you. And the energy, the Red Bull, would enable you to keep God's law. So you were justified by grace, but not as an act that was finished, but as an act where God would energize you so you could begin to earn righteousness and then earn status before him. So it wasn't that what Christ has done was the full and final thing that was needed and we only needed to trust him. It was that God, as it were, gave us a big push on the swing, but we have to finish by pumping on our own. And so at the last analysis, it is our righteousness, not God's righteousness. So grace was commodified as well because you went and you got it through the sacraments. And the sacraments had their own benefit in terms of making you right with God. At the same time, there was the sense of mediation. Christ was not sufficient as our mediator before God, or I shouldn't say he wasn't sufficient. They would say Christ's sufficiency is mediated through the church. And the church is what we need to trust in. Because if you trust in the church, you are trusting in what is the bearer of grace. So it wasn't by faith alone in Christ alone, it was by receiving the things the church would give you as a commodity so that you could be right with God. Now, that particular way of doing it is still, ultimately, when you peel it away, Catholic theology. So when Catholicism talks about we're justified by grace through faith, the words sound right, but what they mean by the words turned out not to be what the Reformers were talking about. So it's a word game in some ways, and it's very much going on. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. A third part of this essential was the uncovering of the pure gospel. Martin Luther said over and over and over, the church's true treasure is the gospel. But the trouble was, in that time, the gospel had been buried under a flood of human additions and accretions of all different kinds, so you could hardly get to it. And the fourth essential doctrine that was recovered, and there's many more, but was the nature of the church as the living fellowship, the living spiritual fellowship of God's people, not the institution that consisted in the hierarchy of the church. So the true signs of the church for the Reformers is the Word of God preached there. Now they would also say, are the sacraments performed, meaning baptism and the Lord's Supper, and others would add, and it is their church discipline. But for the Catholic Church, it was, is it in hierarchical line with Peter through the succession of bishops? Again, we'll come back to that. So that was one of the issues that's essential in terms of, I talked about the Reformation involving a rediscovery of essentials that are critical today. A second reason what's important to go back is that the Reformation helps us clarify essential truths, because the spirit of the age tells us that we need to accept or ignore differences, because what really matters is that you have good feelings or a good conscience toward what is going on. So on one side, there's a call for organizational unity, often in interfaith. What we need is all religions to get together, because all religions are saying exactly the same thing, which is incredibly insulting to each of those religious faiths. Jews clearly are not saying the same thing as Buddhists, and Muslims are not saying the same thing as Hindus, and none of them are saying the same thing as Christians. And so if you say, well, we're just all needing to get along because we're all saying the same thing, it is incredibly insulting to someone who really believes that. But in our world, it's wrong to say that no, there's a real difference here that's worth fighting over and even dying over, even though we're going to be loving in the way we deal with this and express it. So quite honestly, the institutional church, and I mean this by largely the main Protestant denominations, have lost any sense of having a central truth, and so they're able to join together. As a matter of fact, the only thing they have to offer is the institution. It is striking. I was reading about the United Churches of Christ. In 1950, they had 2 million members. They're considered one of the 5 major denominations in the United States. Today, they have 500,000. They're 25% of what they were 50 years ago. I mean, it is an incredible thing, and all of them are doing this as the churches empty out. So what they have is the institution of the church, and they're looking to build themselves up by joining in other particular directions. And there's discussions there, but as one Anglican bishop said, and the Anglican Church, and I mean by this the larger Episcopal Church, because there's a very strong evangelical wing, but the Episcopal Church in the United States has emptied itself of any meaningful theology. And one of the Episcopal bishops said, if there is a choice between heresy and schism, separation, dividing the church, always be on the side of heresy. In other words, it is more of a sin to divide the church than it is to teach that Jesus is just an ordinary man. Well, if you take that as your guide, you can see where things are. Now, on the other side of this is that the Roman Catholic Church, as we think back on the Reformation, is welcoming to others, and there was significant changes that occurred at Vatican II in the 1960s, but at its core, so they began to think of Protestants at that particular time as separated brothers rather than as heretics and rebels. But Pope Francis is a fascinating person. He's a very charming man, and he's very strongly in a charm offensive. And he's already done various things to say, for example, Martin Luther was right. And then he'll go on to say he saw the abuses of the papacy and the church, and what he wanted to do was reform them. Now in 1517, that's exactly right. But by 1521, he was calling the Pope the Antichrist and the church the denier of it, because he realized what he thought was just mistakes that were being made showed that the whole system was corrupt at a very deep level. But there's an attempt to bandage over those things and think we can all get together and minimize these. So it's going to be very interesting to watch as October 31st comes up. There'll be some very interesting actions by the Pope and by others around them. The other side is that, first of all, there are believing Christians in the Catholic Church. And I believe God has saved them, but it's despite what the church teaches rather than because of what the church teaches. But because as our society becomes more and more secularized and anti-Christian, there's a lot of places in which, for example, on the issue of abortion, on the issue of gender and sexuality, what the church teaches, the Catholic Church teaches, evangelical Christians agree with as well. And so on those issues, we stand alongside and say, no, God has taught this. And so there's a temptation to think that because there are important places where we agree, then the areas where we disagree can be turned into things that are irrelevant. But as we'll see as we go through this, there are eternal issues at stake in all of these kind of things. So we need to have a clarity on what is really essential, because the whole pressure of the culture in which we live is to make us back away from strong convictions. Now the trouble is, evangelicals, and I'm going to avoid saying things about politics and so forth, but it's impossible not to. Evangelicals are getting known for more which political party they support rather than what biblical truths they support, and the politicization of the Christian movement is not any help in this way. So that's the third thing. The evangelical church is in danger of losing its birthright in the gospel and of getting absorbed with secondary things or getting fuzzy on the gospel in all kinds of ways. I, to Elizabeth's great dismay, occasionally flick through the religious channels, I was going to call them Christian channels on, so I'll go and I'll flick through to listen to something, and it's amazing how quickly she begins to hear very angry noises from me about these particular things. She thinks I shouldn't be on there in the first place, so what right do you have to have making noises about this? But to hear the truth of the gospel distorted by people who claim to be teaching the Bible is very distressing. So in all of those ways, the Reformation makes us go back and think, what really is of central and eternal importance? Okay, so that was a long kind of, I don't know what it was, but so let's just, again, I want to stop at different times and make sure that if you've got questions or observations, you can ask them or think about them with me, challenges. Anybody? Bruce.
Luther, Germany, Zwingli,
Switzerland.
Calvin, English?
No, Calvin's also part of the Swiss.
Okay.
So because of King Henry VIII and the English Reformation has this, if you were to choose a name, but he doesn't live long enough to do it, it'd be William Tyndale, because of his translation of the Bible into English. But he gets chased out of the country and then gets killed too early in the process. So there's no one major figure in England. John Knox in Scotland becomes a person of great significance, but England doesn't have that kind of person. So, okay, so several people have asked over the way about books and so forth that are helpful, and so I just put down 4 books that in one way or another are useful. If I was going to suggest, here's one that probably would be the one to read. It would be the one called Rescuing the Gospel by Erwin Lutzer, subtitled The Story and Significance of the Reformation. Erwin, well, he was actually lived across the hall from me in seminary, but he was the pastor of Moody Church for a number of decades in Chicago. And not just because he's a friend, but because this is a worthwhile book. I think it's the one that Colleen and Richard are reading together. And Les, I'm going to give this list to Selah. So I saw one copy of this in paperback actually now. So that would be one that I would recommend. One I don't have, because I have it on Kindle rather than here, is the second one that's listed, called by Stephen J. Nichols, The Reformation, How a Monk and a Mallet Changed the World. That one probably traces through, and it's really kind of a series of biographies of the major people, more than would be found. Lutzer's book tends to focus, not exclusively, but strongly on Luther, probably because he's got a Germanic background, Erwin does. This one is a little broader. Now, there's 2 books that I have down. Now, the classic book on Luther is a book called Here I Stand by Roland Bainton. And it's a longer biography. It's older now, I think 1950. But this is kind of the main one to read on Luther. And then 2 books that are similar in terms of titles. The Unfinished Reformation, What Unites and Divides Catholics and Protestants After 500 Years, is this book here. And it is stretching in terms of thinking theologically through some of these issues. So some of you want to look at it on that side. And the book called Why the Reformation Still Matters by Michael Reeves and Tim Chester is also a book that is more based in going through the various kinds of issues, chapters on justification, scripture, and sin, and so forth. And they're both very good books and very helpful. So, lost y'all yet, or are we here? Okay. Let's jump in the deep end and the dark end here. And I want to take some time talking about the medieval church and the papacy, because we won't understand the Reformation, and I don't want to get knee deep in the swamp here, but I do want us to kind of see what's going on. And so I've chosen a few events that are of significance. So if you follow in your outline, the first one is the Great Schism in 1054. Now, in 1054, the Roman Catholic Church excommunicated the Orthodox Church. You need to understand that during the earliest times, and then the Orthodox Church repeated in kind. So they had been fighting for years. The early church obviously was what it was. It grew up in the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, and right away you had a division because you had the Greek-speaking part of the Mediterranean, which tended to be the eastern end, nearer to Greece, and then the Latin-speaking part, and Rome and its influence. Now, by the time the New Testament is written, Paul writes to the Romans in Greek, so it was only over a course of time that you had that. But different things happen, and it became Constantine came along, and he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome in around 313 or 15, somewhere in there, to Constantinople, Byzantium, as it was called, Istanbul, as it's called. It's Istanbul, not Constantinople, if you remember a silly old song that goes, you can blame it on the Turks. So now you have Greek-speaking churches that revolve around especially Constantinople. And many of the great early church councils are held part in that world. And you have the Roman church and its sphere of influence, the Latin church. Now, over the course of time, the Bishop of Rome made more and more claims to importance and significance. And the Bishop of Constantinople and those related to him made more and more changes. And they began to have all kinds of conflicts with one another. But it was still one united church, theoretically, but not actually. But in 1054, the churches divided, and the Pope claimed authority over the entire church. Peter and here is the claim in the statement that was made to the Orthodox Church. Peter and his successors have unfettered authority over the whole church. Now, there was a theological issue that was used as the reason for this debate, and I'm not going to get into that. It related to an addition to the creed, but it was really centuries of language and distrust and disagreement. Now, this becomes important in another way, because what else is going on around 1054? Well, some of it's related to the Muslims are moving into that area, and you begin to have the Crusades begin or developing and battles going on. And the looming shadow of Islam is also going to be a factor, especially as we get to the time of Luther. Now, the Pope has claimed authority over the whole church, and that's debated back and forth, and there's been all kinds of things. One of the great debates has been that there's two swords. There's the sword of religious authority, and there's the sword of imperial or political or military authority. And in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council, the Pope claimed authority over not only the religious realm, but the temporal realm. And so now the Pope is saying, I'm in charge of politics and I'm in charge of the church. And from this point on, there's going to be battles going on between the Pope and others. For example, one of the famous stories is when one of the Holy Roman Emperors came to be crowned as king by the Pope, and the Pope made him wait outside in the snow barefooted before he would come in. All of this was power games related to the claim the papacy was taking. And so at 1215, you had the Pope claim supremacy. And now we're also adding things to what historically has been believed. Transubstantiation is defined, what goes on at the Mass when the bread and the wine, there was teaching related to it. Now it is defined as the official belief that the bread and the wine are actually physically transformed into the body and blood of Christ. Confession is demanded by everybody once a year, and there are now listed for the first time 7 sacraments in the church. And that becomes central to the fact that all of these sacraments are related to this display of grace. This will come up later, but it's important to understand what's going to happen. The church believes that it is the recipient of grace and it can bestow it to others. And they believe in what's called the treasury of merits. And the treasury of merits means that people, by their righteous life, could earn their way to heaven, but have merit left over. So the church gets to take the leftover merit and put it in the church bank. Because Mary didn't need, she was full of grace, so she had more grace than she needed. And so the church gets that. The saints are all people who have more than enough grace that's needed. So the church is administering the merits of the saints that it can now give to other people. Are you following with me that? You've read that, of course, in the book of Corinthians, talks about this whole process. You can see how far we've wandered away from any kind of biblical understanding whatsoever. There's nothing of that in any of the Bible. And now they are going to administer grace, so they have this sacramental power, and they administer it. They administer through confession. They administer it through penance. They will administer it, and this becomes the major issue for Luther, through indulgences that they have the power to give. So that's 1215. Now, for all of these claims of power, there's battles going on back and forth. And so you'll notice the next thing I have down here is the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism. So we've got 2 great schisms. The first one in 1054 is the schism between the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. So they are separated. And they actually, I think Francis went to visit the Archbishop of probably Constantinople, or one of the Russian one is the kind of main one of the Orthodox Church, and that was a huge step made just in the last few years. But the French king was getting strong, and he was not happy with the Pope, and there was battles going on. He sent his troops in to Rome and took over Rome. By force. The Vatican was now overrun. As a result of that, in 1309, he maneuvered in such a way that a French-friendly pope was elected as the next pope. And he chose to move the papacy out of Rome up to Avignon in France. And so for the next 70 years, the Pope will be in France and not in Rome. Now, when you think of all of the things that, because the Roman Church claims that it has the power and it is the thing, there's this huge issue at this particular time. And there will be 7 popes during this period of time. Finally, in 1377, after all kinds of battles back and forth, because people who don't like the French don't like that they've got the Pope. But there's a big papal palace and very luxurious living's been built in Avignon for them. In 1377, Gregory the 11th returns back to Rome and stays there for a time and dies. And when he dies, one group of bishops and cardinals come together and they elect an Italian pope because we want the Pope to be an Italian Pope. But a number of others don't recognize that, and they vote for another Pope who the French like, and he's up in Avignon. So now you have two popes at the same time. 1378 to 1417 is a period in which there will be two popes. There will be 4 different popes in Rome. There will be 3 different popes in Avignon. Each of them is claiming apostolic succession. Each of them is claiming to be in the position of authority and control. And finally, the church gets really upset about this and says, we've got to solve this. And in 1409, they call together a council in Pisa, the city where the Leaning Tower of Pisa is. And the Council of Pisa deposes the existing 2 popes and elects a 3rd pope. But the first 2 don't accept the resignation. So now you have 3 popes at the same time. So when you hear talk about papal infallibility, you recognize there's some pretty challenging issues in your history here to deal with this. And that goes on, as the notes say, from 1378 to 1417. And there are 3 popes. Finally, this leads to something related to, and you notice under the next one, I call it the conciliar movement. Now you're wondering, what is all this? Why are you going into all of this? Well, all of it's background to what's going on, and we need to see the undercurrent here of what is going on. There are a series of councils, and the councils are claiming that it's in the bishops. So now the Pope is becoming more like the modern Queen of England. She has no real power. It's kind of, at best, a first among equals. That's not true of the modern queen, but the idea that the papacy is a kind of limited monarchy. But its whole claim is to be an absolute monarchy. You remember, that was what 1054 is about. I'm over all of the churches. And then 1215, the Pope is over not only all of the churches, it's over all of political empires as well. So the councils come in, and the councils begin a series. So there's the one in Pisa, and then the one in Constance in 1414, and it lasts for 3 years to 1417, and it's got to deal with the multiple papacies. And what it does is to remove all 3 and appoint one pope. So now we're back to one, Martin the 5th. Now there's another issue that's important at that particular time, and there's somebody out in, as we would know it today, the Czech Republic, Prague, Bohemia is the area, and he's causing trouble. We'll talk about him next week, a man named Jan Hus. And John Hus is someone who's come to believe what John Wycliffe taught about the Bible. They're very concerned about that. And so they summon John Hus. They promise him safe treatment. And John Hus comes to Constance, and he's immediately thrown in jail. And then they bring him on trial, and they burn him at the stake as a heretic. Now, what that's important, as he was dying, this will come up again next week. As he was dying on the thing, he said, Hus in Czech means goose. He said, you may cook this goose, but in 100 years, a swan will arise over whom you will not prevail. He was killed in 1415. 100 years later, 1515. Well, let's add 2. Martin Luther comes on the scene. And Luther and others said, this is the swan. Hus's goose has led to God's swan at this particular time. So there's a couple of other councils, but now Martin V has come in, and Martin V is elected by the Council of Constance. It had a number of reforms all through the church. It was intended to say, this is how we're going to do things with councils. So he gets elected pope, and he says, I reject all of those reforms. I'm now the pope. And so from now on, so we're at 415, the next 100 years, until the Fourth Lateran Council in 1512 to 1517. So you're tracking with me with the dates there, 1517, is where finally the papacy has been kind of recovered entirely from this, and it's now back in power and authority. So you have, under this last part, Renaissance supremacy, let me just say this and then I'll talk for a bit. You have the reassertion of papal supremacy. So Martin V repudiates the council's view of the papacy, and now he begins to assert his power and authority. And one of the things that's happened is, so nobody was in Rome for 70 years as pope. And then for the next you had groups, and so Rome is run down. And one of the ways in which this is going to be taken care of is, well, Pope Nicholas V, who is pope in 1450. And I'm quoting from him. Only the learned who've studied the origin and development of the authority of the Roman Church can truly understand its greatness. Thus, to create solid and stable convictions in the minds of the uncultured masses, there must be something which appeals to the eye. A popular faith sustained not only on doctrines, a popular faith sustained only on doctrines will never be anything but feeble and vacillating. But if the authority of the Holy See, that is, the papacy, were visibly displayed in majestic buildings, imperishable memorials, and witnesses seemingly planted by the hand of God himself, belief would grow and strengthen from one generation to another, and all the world would accept and revere it. Notable edifices combining taste and beauty with imposing proportions would immensely conduce to the exaltation to the chair of St. Peter. So what happens over the next while, and this fits right into the story here. They raise the existing St. Peter's. They knock it down, and they're building a new St. Peter's Cathedral. They refurbish over these next years the Vatican Chapel and a particular ceiling there that you may have remembered in one of the chapels. They rebuild or replenish the Vatican Library with Greek and Latin books and manuscripts. They decorate the city with bridges and tombs and fountains and churches. They hire the greatest of the artists of the time to come in and build statues, the Pietà and other things. They bring in others to design the dome on St. Peter's Cathedral, which is unique to its time. They bring in great artists like Michelangelo and Da Vinci and Raphael and so forth. All of that is going on at a huge cost, and now they've got to get money to support this. So now we're going to go to the last thing, but you wonder, well, what relevance is that? That's why the indulgences were being sold, to get money. And a lot of other things were going on to get that sold. So it is this kind of darkness that's going on that begins to feed this in many ways. Connor, I saw your hand up a while ago. Does it still have a question you wanted to ask?
The Fourth Lateran Council happened in 1215. You put that earlier, and now there's another one in 15.
I'm sorry, it's not the Fourth
17.
Lateran Council. It is another Lateran Council, and I don't have the numbers right. So you're quite right. One of those two. I'm not sure. I think I got it wrong the first time. I think it's the Second Lateran Council in 1215, and the fourth is in 1517. But Lateran is, I'm not sure, it's the name of a church, St. John Lateran Church in Rome, which was notable because it had within it the stairs from Herod's palace, or Pilate's palace, that were taken up, the Scala Sancta. They're still there today. You can go and see them. Of course, relics we'll talk about that in just a minute. Any questions? I know I'm throwing a fair bit at you here, but
it just keeps coming back in my mind. And Christianity seems so divided because is it divided because of human nature? And if it is divided because of human nature, do we find this in other religions, such as the Muslim religions and so on, the same type of divisions?
well, I think
He means like Baptist, Lutheran,
I
Methodist.
think
No, I'm talking about other
I
religions.
think if you think of Islam,
Islam.
you think of the huge difference between the Sunni Muslims, represented, for example, by Saudi Arabia, and they hate Iran, which is Shia Muslims. And then you have the Sufis as another branch, within
So we do
that.
find
And
it
so there's
in the other-
intense hatred between those groups, or animosity between those groups within Islam. So, yeah, it is present there. And then you have different kinds of Shias. So you have, or Sunnis. So you have the Saudi Arabia kind, the Wahhabi kind of Islam, which is very different than what, for example, Indonesia has as its kind of view of Sunni Islam. So, yeah.
Can I just ask a question? It's a question I know the answer to, but I think no, it's not. It's not really a question. But isn't it true? I need to go back into church history to figure out somewhere between the time when the disciples were left, somewhere after the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., and the progression of the church into darkness. So it's two statements or questions. One, hopefully somebody still believes the gospel, even though the church is becoming institutionalized. Number two, all these people that were reformers came right out of the darkness. I mean, Wycliffe in 13 something or other. I mean, he was a priest, right? Mm-hmm. These guys are all priests in the darkness. So
Calvin was not a priest. He was studying for the priesthood, and his father wanted him to shift to become a lawyer. So he never was part of his father was, but he wasn't. Zwingli certainly was, and Wycliffe was, Jan Hus was,
right.
Tyndale was. Yep.
Yeah, so I feel like looking at the darkness, when Morgan and I were in London and we took that heritage tour of the English Reformation, the 1,000 years, it was so striking that darkness is so black when the gospel is shut out. And so it's almost like there's a spontaneous combustion happening in different places by God's Spirit. I mean, I know God's got everything planned and He's unrolling the scroll. But darkness is darkness. It feels dark today, but it doesn't feel that dark. But the church itself is they don't have a Bible. Nobody has a Bible, and they keep it in Latin so nobody can read it even if they wanted to. I mean, those are dark things. We at least have some lights.
Well, they not only don't have the Bible, things in church are being conducted in Latin, in a language they don't understand. Now, that's part of what happened because Wycliffe began to teach in English and translated the Bible from Latin into English. And Jan Hus spoke in Czech in the church, Bethlehem Chapel in downtown Prague. You can still go in and visit in that particular church. So there were people and there were movements in different places, but...
The Lollards.
I'm sorry?
The Lollards.
Well, the Lollards were followers of Wycliffe, and you have the Waldenses and and a few other groups as well. We don't know a lot of them because they had no power or authority to be remembered. Nikki?
How did the language of the church get away from the language of the people?
How did it get away from the language of the people? You mean like Latin, for example? I mean, I don't know that I can explain how that happened. I think you began to, part of it was you began to have other theological problems, but you had a priestly class who were viewed as in a separate category. So you had this, rather than having the sense of the priesthood of all believers and people who may have gifts that are serving the church, you had people put in elevated positions, in sacramental positions. And much of what happened within Catholicism, I think, the early church at that time, was taking secular views of authority and turning them over into the church. Now, it's a very hierarchical world. It's a world in which there is no middle class. You have the nobles and you have the peasantry, and you have the clerics. And part of what is going on at this period on another side, we'll talk about this next week, is you're beginning to have the Enlightenment happening, in which there's a kind of fresh wind of going through, not by bringing in so many things new, but by actually going back to the original. At the same time, well, this stuff is going on, it's pretty bleak. You have Christopher Columbus setting out to cross the world in another direction. And Spain and Portugal, because of where they're positioned, are going to be exploring off in different directions around the world. So let me just finish this last part and talk about the corruption of the papacy. By the time now, we're around 1500, and this is where Luther is going to be, and you have different popes, but at this point, the pressure of the papacy is to rebuild and reestablish the glory of the institution of the papacy and the church in that particular way. And you have, first of all, moral corruption. You have incredible moral corruption going on in the church. Sexual morality with priests openly living in immorality with others. Remember, celibacy is supposed to be the responsibility. It's kind of exemplified in Alexander VI. Alexander VI is the Pope who comes in 1492 to 1502, somewhere in that particular range. And he buys the votes of cardinals. He's Spanish by background. He's a Borgia. You perhaps have heard of the Borgias, who are known for their luxury. Well, he buys the votes of cardinals to become the Pope, and then now he begins to live in this way. He openly fathered children by a variety of mistresses, 9 of them at least. But what was different from him was he brought them into the papal palace to live there openly and publicly. I mean, it's one thing to live in hidden immorality. It's another thing to bring your children in, and he began to move all kinds of different things so that he could retain power in the family. So his concern is with the power of the papacy, and he's very powerful in building that up, but he's far more concerned about his son Juan, who's made a count, and to building up his personal bank account. And his daughter Lucretia, there's a bunch of television programs that have been made about the Borgias, and it is the depth of immorality in any kind of way you want to begin to talk about. Actually, Alexander VI is famous for another simple act, in that I mentioned Spain and Portugal being doing their exploring at this particular time, and they were fighting with one another about just where things go. So he took a map of the recognized world and drew a line down and said, well, this side belongs to Spain and this side belongs to Portugal. So that's why in Africa you have Portuguese, you have Angola and Mozambique and others, and Brazil, because he drew the line cutting off that section So you have Brazil, and then you have all the rest are Latin American, Spanish kind of countries. Just that's Borgia's line. To pull that through. Now on the other side, you have, and then after the Borgias came a lot of the Medici popes. You remember the name Lorenzo de' Medici? Florence, and the power and glory of Florence. Now you're into very much the Renaissance period and the lavish lifestyles and the patronage of the arts. They were much more known for that than they were for spirituality. And when Luther posts the 95 Theses, it is Leo, who's a Medici, who's on the throne, the papal throne, and when he hears the news of this, he says, "Oh, well, it's the writings of a drunken German monk who'll feel differently when he wakes up." But he's concerned to protect the power of that. Now, the other thing that's going on is financial corruption in a huge way. So you have the lavish lifestyles of the clergy, you have the rebuilding of the Pope, the rebuilding of Rome by the Pope, and it's going to be financed on the basis of simony. Do you know what simony is? Simony is the selling of a church office for money. Where did that name come from? Remember Simon in the book of Acts, who comes and says, "You've got this power to dispense the Holy Spirit, and how much can I pay you for that?" Well, that's why it's called simony. So, and this will affect the Reformation, because what happens at the Reformation is the Archbishop of Saxony, he's already got two bishop jobs. And the first one he got when he was 11 years of age. So his parents bought one for him, and then he bought another one, and he wants a third one. And he goes to the Pope so he can become a cardinal. And he goes to the Pope and says, "How much do I need to pay to get to be Archbishop of Mainz?" And the Pope sets a very high cost. I think it was something like 60,000 whatevers, which is millions of dollars. And he doesn't have the money. He's got lots of land and all these other things, but he doesn't have the money. So the Pope says, to raise the money, you can sell indulgences in this area. And he hires Tetzel, and Tetzel comes, and that's why Luther, so all of this is playing into this. So you have simony, you have indulgences that are going on to sell things, you have relics. I mentioned before the Scala Sancta, the scares, but people collected all of these relics and they put them in churches because you could come and pay a fee and you could look at that particular relic and you would get years off, a certain number of years off in purgatory for them. So here's these other interesting things that begin to converge together. One of the prime times for doing it and viewing the relics of the saints was All Saints' Day. All Saints' Day is what day? No. All Saints' Day is November 1st. Halloween, Holy Evening, is the day before All Saints' Day. So if you wonder why was Luther doing this then, it's because the next day, even in the church in Wittenberg, where he was a priest, Frederick the Great, who was the political leader of the area, we'll get into this, had 19,000 relics you could come and visit and get time out and pay. So this was his cash day that was coming up the next day. So you had all of those things going on, all of these money-raising schemes. And again, I'm anticipating. You'll understand this on a human level. Germans hated their money going to Italy. They did not want to build buildings in Rome. So part of when Luther attacks indulgences and money, and it's going to the Pope, some of the response is not about theology at all. It's going to be about just nationalistic anger at money going out of town. So A lot of the Reformation stuff isn't going to be just straight, hey, we found great spiritual truths. It's a mixture of human depravity and all kinds of other stuff. So the last thing is the theological corruption of the papacy. So you have Father Pope. The church is, he is the father of the Father Pope. He is the vicar of Christ, through whom grace is channeled. I must confess, even when the Pope came to the United States, 2 years ago was it, or 3 years ago? And it was fascinating for me, not being Catholic, to look at the responses of people for whom, just to see him, but if you really are sincere in your understanding, he is the vicar of Christ, who is not just the head of the church, but he is the agent through which grace is channeled into the church and then into the sacraments through which everything comes at that particular point. So you have that, you have the cult of saints and the treasury of merit. You had purgatory, which becomes another financial thing, and we'll talk about that on a later time. Transubstantiation. So the priest raises the bread, the element, and says over it, "Hoc est corpus meum." Hoc est corpus meum. And people began to listen to that and realize there was something happening there they didn't understand. And out of that came a slogan that we use today. Yeah, hocus pocus is taken out of the Latin of that particular. That's not awfully reverent, but that was where that term came from at that stage. And you had penance and you had sacramentalism. Now, a couple of other things, just to say here. Two things become very significant, and we'll talk about these more next week. Gutenberg in 1454 invents movable type and the printing press. So the first and the first Bible will be, the first book he will produce will be a Bible in Latin. In 1615, on a press, Erasmus, who's a great humanist scholar of the time, will publish a Greek New Testament, which will be the first time people have been able to read, ordinary people. No, I mean, how many ordinary people read Greek? But the priests were supposed to be able to do it. Certainly Luther could and Zwingli could. And they began to read the Bible in Greek for the first time. Never had that experience before. And all of a sudden it became aware that they had been using the Latin Vulgate, and the Latin Vulgate was wrong on all kinds of important places. We'll come back to that. Okay, that's a whole lot of stuff, and hopefully it will get more interesting as time goes on. But next week, I want to talk a little bit more about the political setting of this, and then we'll begin to talk around the lives of Wycliffe and Hus, and then get into the life of Martin Luther. Now let me see if there's any questions or whether your eyes have all rolled back in your head and glassy. Elizabeth.
This is just a PS on the darkness of the times. I mean, 1 Timothy says, watch out for those guys going around forbidding you to eat making you eat certain foods, forbidding marriages, advocating abstaining from foods and such. So that's where some of that stuff came from. And then the Galatians in 48, when Paul's writing that, he's warning them about going back to Judaism, same as the book of Hebrews. So all of that kind of stuff was warned against in the New Testament, wasn't it? So, I mean, that's where it was born. Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And some of it also comes out of the Roman religious structures as well. So some of the very titles of the Pope are titles that were used in Rome for their high priest. So.
Hi. We're Anabaptist Sabbath keepers.
I'm sorry?
We're Anabaptist Sabbath keepers.
No.
Thank you.
I don't. I don't, well, I mean, I don't, there may have been some who did that, but I don't know of any Sabbath keeping was not an issue at that particular, well, Sabbath keeping became an issue, but on Sunday, some wanted to use the Sabbath principle, and that was an issue more in the Reformed areas than in Lutheran areas. Okay. We'll get the list to Doug, and then we'll let you know when some of those books are available, so you can find out what the correct reading on all of this is, rather than what I'm saying. So, all right. Thank you all. Let me close in prayer. Father, we've talked about the darkness tonight, and it becomes amazing to us to read some of these things and say, how could you ever open up a Bible and get there? And yet we know how easily deception can come in our own hearts, how easily we put other things in a place that only belongs to your word and your truth. So help us not to see here and feel proud that we're not following those false ideas, but give us the determination to be people who live under the authority of your word, under the authority of your Son, for the glory of our great God. We thank you for all that's ours in Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.